So we come to Daniel proper today, if you want to call it that. Last week we took a brief view of the historical background, which included the rise and fall of Babylon, the fall of Assyria, the capture of the 10 northern tribes in 721 BC of the nation of Israel, and then subsequently the capture of Israel itself in 605 BC by the armies of Nabopolassar, a common household name we discovered. Most of you, have that on your refrigerator doors at home, I'm sure. Nabopolassar was the overall conquering monarch of the Babylonian Empire, but then he had some difficulties and wound up dying rather abruptly, while his son, a more common name, Nebuchadnezzar, was in the process of being the general of his dad's armies, as they had gone down and done a couple of things. Earlier, they had whipped the Egyptian and Assyrian forces at the Battle of Carchemish. That was about halfway up the Euphrates River. If you're thinking Persian Gulf, then you arc up the river Euphrates, which dumps into the Gulf, until you get to southern Turkey. About halfway up there, there was this rather notable battle that took place. We spoke of that last Lord's Day as well. And that pretty well broke the back. The Assyrian Empire just kind of melted away at that point. And to teach Egypt a lesson, then the armies of Babylon had journeyed off, down, around, and come right down the Mediterranean, edge of the Mediterranean, which takes it right dead square through Israel. And they had wound up, whipping up on pretty severely on the Egyptians once again. The problem was, when it came to Israel, that King Josiah had decided that what he would do is make friends, and so he had taken arms and got himself killed in a previous battle as well. And on the way back through, then the armies of Babylon, after Nebuchadnezzar had shot home as fast as he could, learning his father's death, secured the kingdom with being crowned as the king of the Babylonians, and then had gone back and met up with his army in the southern end of Israel and laid siege to Jerusalem. The two southern tribes, of course, still had their freedom, if you want to call it that, which was soon to cease to exist. And at this point in time, in 605, is when Daniel was taken captive, okay? And then subsequently removed and taken back to Babylon. Now, you and I today would just hop kind of a local flight out of Jerusalem and just go, ooh, boom, and land right down on the Persian Gulf. It was quite an extensive and difficult journey in that day and age. I've only been able to kind of imagine when Nebuchadnezzar was in the process of surrounding Jerusalem in the early summer of 605 with his father's army, and then learned of his father's death in August. He managed to make it home, okay, clear back up around down the Euphrates Tigris River complex and almost all the way to the Persian Gulf to Babylon, the Old Testament site, to be crowned king, go through the ceremonies and solidify his power base, and then got all the way back, okay, all in the space of about 5 weeks, as best I can tell. What it boils down to is he probably rode a lot of horses to death.
Yeah.
He and his entourage, his bodyguard that made that trip. Because they were over and back, and that is just a far piece of ground to cover if you're doing it on horseback, which would have been the way he would have traveled at that time for speed. Daniel, then, with the fall of Jerusalem in the end of September of that year, was one of a number of people taken captive. And the question that comes up is, why do you even have Daniel chapter 1 recorded? I'll bet everybody's thought of that. Your mind doesn't work the way mine works, okay? Which you should be thankful for. We won't even follow that. We won't pursue that at all. But you know, we often think of Daniel being a great book of prophecy, predictive type prophecy, as well as proclamatory prophecy. And while it is that, the but comes up, there is no prophecy anywhere in Daniel chapter 1. Why is this even recorded? Why is it there? I'm going to leave that there and let you kind of wrestle with that a little bit and chew on it as we go through what we're covering this morning in our time together. So beginning in chapter 1 with the very first couple of verses, we find some dating that helps us a little bit. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, with a part of the vessels of the house of God, looted the temple, which he carried to the land of Shinar, more on that in a moment, back to Babylon, to the house of his God, that's Marduk, when he gets back there. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of Marduk, a pagan deity, the main principal deity of the Babylonian Empire. Now, what happened here, for those of you that like to study some of this stuff, is there actually was very little, comparatively, loss of life in this whole siege thing in 605. Don't get this confused with the siege situation in 588 to 586. That was nearly a 2-year siege later on that occurred. And at that point, the city basically was completely destroyed. The temple was torn down, you know, and everything that went with it. Different events. This one preceded that. And the reason that there was very little loss of life is the prophet Jeremiah had predicted that this would occur, that Babylon would be used by God to chasten Israel, and that the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin, if they were wise, would recognize that this was God's chastening hand and not try to fight off the Babylonians. Okay? Just be in subjection and allow themselves to be overtaken, taken captive, you know, and so forth to preserve their lives. Most of the citizens of Jerusalem did exactly that. So there's very little loss of life at the point where Daniel is taken captive in 605. Okay? Jeremiah essentially had said, you fight, you'll be killed. End of discussion. And God says, don't fight so that you can remain in the land, but you will need to undergo the chastening hand of the Babylonian Empire. Okay? Some of them actually listened. Okay? Now, the important note here for those of you that pursue the study of prophecy, in 605 is the date that begins with the fall of Jerusalem, what is called the times of the Gentiles. Okay? This is an era that is comprised of 2 significant issues that have to do with prophecy and even the second return of Christ. Let me give them to you real briefly. It's a little outside of where we want to go this morning. Number 1 is that the land that God had given to Abraham's descendants would be under the dominion of Gentiles. Okay? Would be subject to Gentile dominion. Okay? But there was a second thing that sometimes is forgotten, that the Davidic throne, the throne of David, would be empty of a rightful heir to the line of David. So until there is a rightful heir to be seated on the throne, and until the Gentile dominion ceases over the land of Israel as given to Abraham clear back in Genesis 15, that's the times of the Gentiles. You can cross-index and make a note of the following, and that is Luke chapter 21, verse 24. Jesus himself, being predictive, prophetical, in speaking of the coming events that would affect Jerusalem and Israel, specifically said that Jerusalem, following his crucifixion, would be trodden down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles would be fulfilled. So that particular term is nailed down pretty solid in biblical literature and biblical prophecy. It's a period of time. It doesn't have a specific time range. We like to put years, months, weeks, and so forth to everything. You can't do it. Christ's prophecy placed the end of this time into the future until those two conditions are met simultaneously. Jerusalem has been trodden down by the Gentiles off and on for the last 2,000 years. But there's never been a king of the line of David that sat on the throne ruling and reigning. So those two of those, that is the times of the Gentiles. Okay? The captivity of Israel. Israel goes into captivity, we find in these first two verses, with all kinds of peripheral stuff that we'll refer to a little bit as we go. Israel went into captivity because God had a specific covenant with the nation of Israel. You can refer to Deuteronomy 28 through 30, the blessings and the cursings. Most of us are familiar with at least chapter 28, a little bit. This was where God promised the nation of Israel that he would bless them if they were obedient. They would be fruitful, they would multiply, they would be wealthy, they would be prosperous, and so forth. But if they failed to be obedient to the Mosaic economy, then God's chastening would come upon them. He would curse them instead of blessing them. That's the terminology that's used. Okay. Now, on a national basis, you find that the 10 northern tribes were by far more wicked than the 2 southern tribes. They were less God-centered, they were more idolatrous, and so forth. The Assyrians had been used by God when the Assyrian dynasty was in place to capture the 10 northern tribes. But they could not get the 2 southern tribes captured. In fact, God performed a miracle and decimated the Assyrian army in one night and sent them back home with their tail between their legs. Okay. That had occurred well over 100 years before the capture of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 605. Okay. Verse 2 very clearly tells us that it was God who delivered up Judah to the Babylonian Empire. You see, you and I, human history would say they lost the fight. One military was bigger than the other. Too many numbers, too many tanks and flamethrowers or whatever. They couldn't hold up, against smart missiles or shillelagh rockets or whatever it happened to be. No, it says God did that. Now, he may have used all kinds of human implements, and he certainly here used, you can read the book of Habakkuk sometime, you can see that God is utilizing even pagan dynasties. He's using a whole worldview system of military, economic, world dictatorship in the known world at that time as his, I guess you would call it, paddle to chasten the nation of Israel, big time. Okay? Nebuchadnezzar, in effect, was God's instrument to chasten the nation's disobedience. Wow. Now, here's a question you can reflect upon. Do you think God has changed his ability to chasten a disobedient nation? Food for thought, right? Moving right along. Marduk, or some pronounce it Marduk, but Marduk is what I was taught, was the chief god of the Babylonians. By the way, the word Babylonia that you get here is the Hebrew word for Shinar. If you want your little Bible trivia, if you go back to chapter 11, you know that Nimrod came out on the plains of Shinar and began to create cities and his own little, kingdom in itself. That's where it was. It was down close to the mouth of the Euphrates River, where it dumps into the Persian Gulf. So you got now the program for what is going on with Daniel at this point in time, and he's probably somewhere in his early teens. He hadn't yet 20 yet. I'll explain that to you later. So he's probably between 14 and 18, somewhere in there, at the time. Excuse me, he and his friends were taken captive. Here's what the king had in mind with capturing and removing Daniel from Israel to Babylon. Verse 3. The king spoke to, let me get my glasses focused, Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom there was no blemish, well-favored, skillful in wisdom, cunning in knowledge, understanding science, and such had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning, the culture, I'll put it that way, and the tongue, the language of the Chaldeans. Another word for Babylonians. It's just an older word. The king, verse 5 says, appointed them a daily provision of the king's food. King James has meat. Just think food. Okay? Banquet table. And of the wine which the king drank. So nourishing them 3 years, that's the length of the program, that at the end of that time they might stand for inspection by the king. Okay? So it's a 3-year training program. And verse 6 says, now among these were the children of Judah. This is their Jewish names. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, they renamed them. The prince of the eunuchs gave names to them because you don't want these Jewish kids running around. You're going to try to make Babylonians out of them culturally. So Daniel, he gave the name of Belteshazzar. And to Hananiah of Shadrach, to Mishael, he gave Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. Okay? That's most of us know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But ask people at the next Bible trivia game that you have what their Jewish names were, and you can pat yourself on the back, when you got them right there. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, these were royal captives. They took the high end, the cream of the crop, so to speak, of the ruling parties, the ruling families that were found in Jerusalem. They took all the teenage sons. No, the women weren't part of this package. They took the sons to educate, train, and, ready for it, indoctrinate into the Babylonian culture. Today we would call that grooming. You've probably heard that term if you've been around the news feeds. They were captives, and yes they were, but while they were captives, the greater idea was to bring in a group of native-born Jewish youth into maturity in the ways of the Babylonian Empire, to train them in Babylonian culture, to indoctrinate them, okay? And if the need would perhaps arise in the future, then as grown men, the king of Babylon could insert them back into Israel as the leaders of Israel, the polished, educated, trained men that would step back in and provide the leadership capacity within the nation. And what would that accomplish? Well, it would wind up directing the Jews into subservience to Babylon, because these guys would now think Jew, or they'd think Babylonian. They'd think a different culture. They'd be programmed that way. Ashpenaz, mentioned in verse 3, was the court official with the oversight of this group. It was a 3-year program, as we've mentioned. It included a lot of stuff that was involved in a very elite education there. Probably included nearly every aspect of Babylonian culture: architecture, agriculture, astronomy, astrology, law, mathematics, politics, military, economics, trade, and probably a whole lot more. All from the Babylonian point of view. Okay? All equipped that way. Okay? Now, it also includes an elite diet. Hang on to that. We're going to cover that separately in just a minute. How many were taken captive? Who knows? Don't know. Don't know. How's that? We know at least 4. The 4 that were mentioned here. But there's no number that is given anywhere to say there were, 692 or 11,419, or whatever it happened to be. Nope, none of that. Okay. All of these 4, however, that were mentioned here, play a very significant role in the life of Israel and the city of Jerusalem in the time to come as well. Okay. Now, they were renamed. I'll just give you a quick, I get kind of bored with this, so forgive me if I come across that way with this type of detail. Daniel, the name, it depends upon which expert you refer to, exactly how these things are spelled out. But Daniel means in the Hebrew language, God is judge. Belteshazzar, his Babylonian name means protect the king. Hananiah means Yahweh is gracious, but the Shadrach name is Aku's command. Now, Aku is the moon god for the Babylonian Empire. Mishael is who is what God is. That's what the name means. He was renamed Meshach, who is what Aku is. And Azariah means Yahweh has helped, and he was renamed Abednego, which is servant of Nebo. Okay. And by the way, Nebuchadnezzar's name, the the way we spell it, okay, was originally Nebo. It's by the way, the Babylonian god of agriculture. So, okay, so more trivia for you to file away. Now, what was the likely idea? Well, it's pretty easy with the way I've presented it, I think, to come up with a conclusion. The idea is to erase any name or word usage which would bring their Jewish heritage into their minds. Rename you and you become a different person is the idea. Okay? Replace their Jewish identity with a Babylonian construct. Culturally speaking, there was a built-in pressure to conform to the Babylonian cultural standard because, after all, they were now Babylonians. That's what their names were. There also, by the way, have been kind of a carrot dangled out in front of them to get them to move in that direction. Conform to our standard and you'll gain position and wealth. More on that in just a moment. Okay, then you got the pathway, I guess, here. The pathway of conviction, okay? The next few verses to kind of keep the flow of the story going. But, big word. I know it's only 3 letters, but that's the way verse 8 starts. But, they were put in this environment to be groomed and to be shaped and molded, into a supple tool that was going to be used by the Babylonian king. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's food, nor with the wine that the king drank. Therefore he requested from the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. By today we'd say he wanted a religious exemption, okay, in effect. Okay? But notice he just didn't go out and try to burn the palace down either. So there's a right way and a wrong way to do things, whole subject in itself. Verse 9 says, now God had brought Daniel into the favor and tender love. That's Hesed, by the way, there. It's the word that's normally used in relationship to God's love for Israel. With the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. This has got nothing to do with me. Why? He said, what are you appealing to me for? He said, I didn't make the rules. The king made the rules. You know, I don't like being caught in the middle of this. Okay? Why should he see your faces worse liking than the children of the rest of them of your sort? You will endanger me and my head to the king. Yeah, don't put my head on the block, boy. You know? Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants, King James's proof. Test your servants, I beseech you, for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables. King James' word is pulse. It means vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and eat of the portion of the king's food. In other words, compare us. We're going to have a test group. People do this all the time, right? Laboratory type stuff. You've got a control group that gets, this stuff, and then the other group gets this stuff. And at the end of 3 years, you see how many of them, are still alive, or, how many of them have grown a second head, or whatever the test is designed to do. So he consented in the matter. At the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared better, fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which ate of the king's food. And Melzar took away the portion of their food and the wine that they should have drank, and gave them vegetables to eat. There you have it. Okay? In a nutshell, you've got this little story that many of us are at least some familiar with. The food issue referred to earlier came from the king's table. This was the best of the best. Okay? This is what the king himself ate, and the king did not eat leftovers, I dare to mention. Okay? Yeah. However, for a Jewish kid, there were several issues. I'm sure you thought maybe one or two as you've been seated there. First off, that food had very likely been prepared by Gentiles, okay? By other slaves in Babylon. Okay? That in and of itself would have made it unclean. Okay? Gentiles couldn't prepare Jewish food for Jews. It just didn't work that way. Okay? It wasn't kosher. Secondly, at least some of it, and most likely a good portion of it, was probably forbidden by the dietary laws of the Mosaic law system. You want to know some specifics? Just write down Leviticus 11. It's the food chapter, and that spells out everything it could eat. It has to be cloven-footed, it has to chew the cud, it has to creep this way or crawl that way, or so many legs or fly, but not this or that. There's all kinds of specifics that go through there. You could eat some types of bugs, but you couldn't eat other types of bugs. You could eat, you had to have scales, so you couldn't eat eel. I know that disappoints many of you that were thinking that, but it's, you went all kinds of that stuff that was distinctive, okay? And if it was forbidden by the Mosaic Law Code, then it would have been forbidden to Daniel. That's the way he looked at it. And most likely, and this is something that most of us don't pick up, that everything on the king's table would have been offered to the Babylonian gods before it was ever put on the table. Because the religious system of the Babylonian Empire was very specifically, given over to thanking their gods, Marduk, primarily, but they had a multiplicity of them. So they couldn't do the king's table, if they were going to go by what God had given specifically to the Jewish people, as far as their food intake. The wine issue, by the way, strong drink was prohibited. Now, we look at it differently. We look at, gin, vodka, whiskey, we think of that as strong drink. They didn't have that stuff back then. Strong drink meant that you had undiluted wine. That was the primary picture of what they're looking at. The standard cut or dilution factor was minimum of 3 to 1, 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Most places that I've read of the Jewish culture was at least 6 to 1, and in some cases as much as 10 to 1. Okay? So you get the idea, that minimum mixture that is there. And the Babylonians, you may have guessed at this point, did not dilute their wine at all. Okay? So, pure battery acid, right down the hatch, right? If they want, get drunk in a hurry if you're going to get drunk. That was their motto, I guess, type of thing. So, you have Daniel's request found in the last part of verse 8, and then you find the God at work in the life of a pagan, okay, in a completely ungodly individual that was part of the Babylonian culture. He was a servant of Babylon, and God grants Daniel favor in this man's life. Okay. But he has a concern, doesn't he, that you find in verse 10, already mentioned. He says, you're trying to put my head on the chopping block here. That the king gave this order, and now you're coming to me and asking me to sidestep the king's order. The word of this gets out, and you're going to have 2 pieces of me laying here on the floor spouting blood, instead of being one guy put together. I'm not real fond of this. My life's in jeopardy. So you have a bargain, if you want to call it that is put together. Daniel says, hey, I understand. He says, how about a trial run? Let's just take 10 days. 10 days isn't going to be a big deal. This is a 3-year program. Okay? And I just want a trial basis. Give us, obviously, it seems like he's including Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the 4 of them at least, and maybe there were others, I don't know. And he said, give us a trial run on the vegetarian diet. I have no idea whether that's anything like the Mediterranean diet or the Hayupi diet or the cookies and ice cream diet or something of equal value. Don't know. But it was vegetables only. And he said, after 10 days, you come in and line us all up, and you pick out the weak and the sickly and see if it's any of us 4 are in that category. And after 10 days, the story speaks for itself. They came back in, and he looked and said, wow, those guys on the veggies, they look better than the guys over here, that are sousing themselves with the king's wine and eating the prime rib and the baked potatoes with extra sugar or whatever. You get the idea. Okay. So that's kind of what they think. Now, the thing is, you say, well, but how did Daniel know about the vegetables? Because there are no vegetables listed anywhere in the law, Mosaic law, that were forbidden to eat. In my opinion, God missed a bet. Because I could put like kale and spinach, and some other things on a forbidden list. But, hey, I'm not going to argue with God. That's all there is to it. My dad raised meat and potato guys, so it still holds true. Okay? But Daniel knew that he could just say, we'll just eat vegetables, and he would not violate the Mosaic law. Okay? So that's the route he took. He's thinking, see? It's how you approach difficult issues. There's a lot you can learn from a leadership potential there. Notice that God here is touching even pagans' men's lives to bring about his will. They're not aware of it. They don't understand it. If they did, they don't recognize it in any way, shape, or form. But God's working through the lives of a pagan Enoch, to bring about his will for these men. Okay? So the outcome, of course, we've already referred to. They matched them up against the King's Table group, and ta-da, they came out 5-star, all the way. You know, worked great, okay? Now, just an aside, this is not an instruction for us to become vegetarians. All right? I think you should probably recognize that. Now, you may wish to follow this diet or some other diet. You know, like I said, I'm big on the ice cream one. And that's fine if you do. You know, go ahead, knock yourself out. There may be health issues. There may be personal preferences, whatever. But meat is not prohibited for believers to consume. 1 Timothy 4, read the first 5 verses, and it tells you that. Now, however, meat offered unto idols is still an issue, because it would be a stumbling block. So read 1 Corinthians 8, and again, you find that stuff that we don't have the time to go into. Okay? What you have here is, in Daniel's life, wasn't nearly so much the diet itself, it was a question of obedience. God had already given his commands to Israel concerning their specific dietary laws. And Daniel, on a personal basis, said, no, I need to be in obedience to that. Nationally, the Jewish people would wind up being chastened because they had violated the Sabbath law, they had violated the rules against idolatry, and everything that went with it, and that's why you had the chastening hand of the armies of the Babylonians. Now, what do we deal with here as far as the dilemma? Daniel is kind of in a bit of a dilemma. How could you and I, in similar circumstances, you know, how do we approach this? How do we reconcile these difficult circumstances? We know what God has said, and we're convicted that that directly applies to us. But our circumstances are, well, yeah, it's going to be really hard, you know, or somebody's liable to laugh at me, or maybe I won't get promoted or get that raise, you know, or maybe the kids at school beat me up, or whatever it happens to be, okay? Various forms of it. Well, you can rationalize the situation. Just think of the Jews in that day and see where you fit. We'd obey under normal circumstances, Lord. We'd be happy if it was a normal situation to obey you. But, you know, the situation is far above normal. After all, we've been taken captive and hauled off hundreds and hundreds of miles to a foreign land, you know, and subjected to the domination of the Babylonian culture, blah, 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 blah. Okay, right? You could do that. Second thing is you could blame God. Essentially, it's like this. It's God's fault for putting me in this situation, so he can't blame me if I feel I need to break the law in order to survive. I mean, it's God's fault. Now, so I'll just go ahead and do the best I can on my own terms. Thank you very much. How about this one? Reasoning ahead. You could say, now, wait a minute. Here's an opportunity to gain places of prestige and power inside of the Babylonian culture. Yeah? We don't want to stick out. We want to blend in and work our way up so that we've got some suds later on in our lives. Surely God wouldn't have us jeopardize an opportunity like that just because of a food issue. Pretty good. Pretty good. Yeah? All right. How about this one? Okay. Disobeying the king's food laws might bring our execution. Surely God wouldn't have that in mind, would he? Or maybe a last one here, a little more subtle. If we disobey, we could bring injury or even death to someone who has responsibility for me. Shouldn't we be concerned about their life? A little bit of compromise isn't a big deal, is it? You know, Peter and John were thrown in the Husgau in Acts, early Acts. and when drug out and told them, they needed to deny the name of Christ or they'd beat them, put them back in jail. They said, well, you got to do what you think you need to do. But as for us, our responsibility is to obey God rather than man. He didn't say, Scripture never teaches, obey God when it's convenient. Obey God when it's comfortable. Obey God when you gain a privilege. Obey God when you can rationalize it. He says, no, you need to obey God. It's just really that simple. Last few verses as we come to a close here. Now, if you are thinking somehow that Roger is always going to cover an entire chapter as we go through Daniel, you need to beat yourself with a wet noodle or something, because that's very likely not going to happen. Verse 17, these four children in its context, they're different words. There's like 4 different words for children in the Jewish culture. This one means underneath 20, after puberty, but under 20, so we're talking about a teenager. These 4 teenagers, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding, additional understanding is the idea, in visions and dreams. Now, at the end of the days that the king had said he would bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs, 3 years has passed. All right? Boom! Between 17 and 18, 3 years has passed. The prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them. In other words, he checked them out. He vetted them, as we would put it today. Among all of them, there was no one found that was in the same category as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, as they stood before the king. And in all manners of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. And Daniel continued into the first year of the king Cyrus. That was under the Babylonian thing. More on that later. Okay? God is preparing these men for future service for him, isn't he? He gives them understanding. He gives them knowledge. He gives them literature. And to Daniel, at least, he gave this special ability to interpret dreams and visions. He says they exceeded so greatly during that 3 years that they were considered to be 10 times better than anybody else in the group. Now, that's not quantitative in and of itself. What it means, it's a Jewish idiom, a Hebrew idiom, that just says they were head and shoulders above anybody else that was questioned that day. That's exactly what we're looking at. And you can look at the different occupations. We'll talk about astrologers and magicians and so forth as we go on through the book in their context. And Daniel refers to them, by the way, if you lump them all together, Daniel pretty much refers to them all as a group. He says, here's the group. The magi, the magicians, the wise men, if this would be kind of a special advisory group to the king. More on that as we go as well. Okay. Now, some takeaways here. Well, as we just sum up. Well, the initial stuff, or maybe the preliminary conclusions, I guess, would be that God honors those that honor him. Secondarily, of course, to tie into that is you honor him according to his word, according to his yardstick, not your own. So you can't just pick and choose. Okay? Exodus 19:6 tells us that Israel, called out of Egypt centuries before, was to be a kingdom of priests. The whole nation was to be special in the sight of God, so that the nation could be put on display for all the other peoples of the world to see how the people of God lived. It was a special situation. Obedience brings blessing. Disobedience brings chastening. Deuteronomy 28 through 30 again. All right? To close up, mankind seems to reel from crisis to crisis, just like a drunken sailor, as they say. Okay? The more mankind attempts to control his own destiny apart from God, the deeper the chaos that results for all of humanity. The rejection of God, of a God who is sovereign over the world and sovereign over the affairs of mankind, brings not only bedlam in the realm of men, but is also going to wind up bringing the chastening hand of God. Even while the pagan world rejects that chastening and refuses to acknowledge that God is behind it, God still brings his chastening hand upon them. Mankind has constantly throughout history looked for solutions to his problems without the hand of God being either recognized or wanted. This lends itself to conflict and violence, to dictators, to oppressive governments, and ultimately will pave the pathway to the Antichrist, the one we call the beast of the book of Revelation. Not just the beast coming to power, but he's actually cheered and worshipped in his rise to power. Okay? He's got the red carpet rolled out. If you were going to pick out a theme verse for the entire book of Daniel, I would suggest chapter 4, verse 17. At the end of the chapter, it's a long verse. Okay, at the end of the verse, okay, for 4:17. It says this: in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind. The sovereignty of God. As Shower's book puts it, the Most High God. Okay? A committed believer obeys God's commands for him regardless of the circumstances. It doesn't say anything about it has to be easy or comfortable or profitable. It says, now, the committed believer leaves the results up to God. Okay? He lets God keep score and says, it's God's program. If he's sovereign, I can trust him. The sovereign rule of God, whether recognized by the disobedient or not, but received by the believer of faith, is really the introduction that chapter 1 of Daniel presents. That's why it's there. That's why that chapter stands where it does. It's not just because Daniel was young when the book started. It's because he understood some things about the Most High God. Daniel understood that God will orchestrate events. He'll touch in the lives of men, even pagan men's hearts. He'll direct the will of men. Kings of nations, everything that goes with it. Wow. God's got a plan for mankind. He is sovereign over the affairs of mankind, and we need to rejoice in that. Father, thank you as we bow before you for blessing us. The book of Daniel is rich in so many things far beyond just the predictive aspects of what's going to come in the future. It certainly contains a huge amount of that. But there's so much that we can learn, as well as far as our lives and how we are to honor you. In Jesus' name, amen.